This is Xiao. He's a Yaksha. And you see these guys? They're Yaksha too, only they're pretty different from this guy. Now this might confuse you. I mean, they've all got that masked Power Ranger thing going on, and they look pretty similar, and they seem to regard each other as some sort of found family. So what makes Xiao so different from the rest of them? And what makes a Yaksha a Yaksha? Well, to answer that, we'll be taking a trip to Liyue and doing a deep dive into the history, origins, inspirations, and quirks of the infamous Guardian Yakshas. But we're mostly going to talk about Xiao. You probably don't live in Liyue, so you don't have a Yaksha to keep you safe. But what about a shark? Not just any shark. I'm talking about Surfshark VPN, the sponsor of this video. The basic job of a VPN is to mask your online activity from sneaky thieves who want your data by hiding your IP address, encrypting the actual data that you send and receive, and monitoring your account for suspicious activity. And a menacing little VPN Yaksha is exactly what you need if you have the same spending habits as a certain retired Geo Archon. Surfshark VPN lets you access your banking information securely even on public Wi-Fi, because, you might have forgotten your wallet like a certain someone when you went out. You can safely make your transaction and then use the same VPN to mask your location information so that you can get the best deals while shopping online. A lot of shops change their prices based on your location, so using Surfshark to hide your location information can actually save you money. If you shop online a lot, then Surfshark might end up paying for itself. And if that wasn't enough reason to give Surfshark a shot, I have a snazzy coupon code you can use for 83% off plus an extra 3 months free. Link and code are down in the description box, so give it a click to get your own personal Sharky protection squad. Thanks again for sponsoring this video, Surfshark VPN, and now we're gonna get back to it. So what exactly is a Yaksha? Well, in Genshin, Yaksha are basically the same type of entities as the Adepti, which is why Xiao is often called Adeptus Xiao. Both the Adepti and the Yaksha are from a race of semi-divine immortals known as illuminated beasts. This means that they are enlightened animals, first and foremost, that sometimes take human form. Now, the difference between the Yaksha and the Adepti is mostly in the nuances, as far as anyone can tell. Yaksha are particularly well suited for war and combat, while the other Adepti may have other skills. Think of the Yaksha as Morax's military generals and the Adepti as his overall imperial court. It's not a perfect analogy, but it conveys the general idea. It is also important to remember that all Yaksha are Adepti, but not all Adepti are Yaksha. Now, in Buddhist and Hindu mythology, Yaksha actually possess two forms, or rather, they come in two flavors, I guess. They can either be benevolent nature spirits, which matches most of the Adepti like Cloud Retainer and Mooncarver, or they can be malevolent and violent ghost-like creatures that attack indiscriminately, which matches the Yaksha, although those are rather discerning in their targets, but more on that in a little bit. It is important to note that in mythology, Yaksha are not particularly well defined as a race. They are often lumped together with other divine races such as the Gandharva, the Asura, the Kinnara, the Deva, the Naga, the Mahoraga, and the Garuda. Some of these probably sound a little bit familiar to you, as they should, especially Garuda. Garuda is the primary inspiration for Xiao, which requires a whole section to explain, but I'm bringing this up now to point out how Genshin still considers him a Yaksha despite being a completely separate race in mythology. The same thing appears to happen with Menogias, who has some references to the Ashura race, and you can also make the same case for Bosacius being a Naga or Mahoraga, since his beast form is basically a snake. Interestingly, the Mahoraga, Kinnara, and the Gandharva all share strong associations with music and dance, especially the Gandharva. This association is not traditionally shared by the Garuda or the Yaksha in general, which makes it all the more interesting that Genshin decided to design their rendition of the Yakshas around a type of theatrical performance, the Nuo Opera. The Nuo Opera is a type of religious theater whose purpose is to drive out evil spirits and diseases. Actors within the Nuo Opera would don ceremonial masks which ranged from depictions of terrifying monsters to beautiful characters, and perform a wide variety of dances to ask the gods for blessings and to drive out evil and diseases, which is exactly what Xiao is doing whenever he uses his burst. It even references this in his name card. This is especially noteworthy because when the Archon War ended around 2,000 years ago, Liyue was riddled with plagues, diseases, and disasters, all created by the lingering resentment of all the gods defeated during the war. Seeking an end to his people's suffering, Morax tasked the 5 foremost Yaksha with the responsibility of cleansing the land by slaughtering whatever was left of the former gods. And since those gods were already dead, the Yaksha would have been fighting a type of ghost-like thing, which would have made their task more like a form of exorcism. To don a fearsome mask while cleansing the land of malevolent spirits makes the Yakshas actors in a nationwide ritual Nuo performance. However, exorcism comes at a cost, both in Genshin and in mythology. Buddhism and Hinduism believe that committing foul deeds is how one accrues karmic debt. Little by little, that debt accumulates and corrupts the person or deity. In Buddhist teachings, there are times when a Yaksha is born in an ugly ogre-like form, supposedly because they were humans that committed sins in their previous lives, which caused them to accumulate a lot of bad karma. They then gain a thirst for violence, which causes them to commit more sinful acts, which in turn causes them to accrue more bad karma, which increases their overall karmic debt. In the case of Genshin, however, the Yaksha are doing good things, purging evil from the land, through negative methods, aka slaughter. This causes their karmic debt to increase exponentially. Eventually, a Yaksha's karmic debt becomes too much to bear and the Yaksha succumb to madness or they die in combat. This is the cost of their contract with Morax, and whether or not he was aware of the repercussions at the time he signed it, well, no one's really sure. Speaking of Morax, though, he has a couple of interesting parallels to the deity known as Kubera or Vashravana. Kubera is the god of wealth and contracts relating to money and is generally considered the king of the Yakshas as well as some other similar deities. Now, Morax has basically the same traits. He is also the god of wealth, contracts, and the leader of the Yaksha and the prime of the Adepti, so that checks out. In addition to that, both Morax and Kubera have yellow eyes, and Morax's choice of weapon, the spear, comes from Vashravana, who was depicted with a trident. More often than not, anyway. Kubera and Vashravana are also equated to Bishamon, the god of warriors and treasure in Japanese Buddhism, which might be where Morax also gets his title of war god from. Okay, that should be enough information for you to understand the basics of what a Yaksha actually is. Now it's time to meet the 5 foremost Yaksha. Or rather, all of the Yaksha not named Xiao. While the 5 foremost Yaksha are the most prominent, there are actually 6 total Yaksha that we're aware of. However, Pervases is the most un-Yaksha-like Yaksha ever. This is mostly because he's a crane, which is the symbol of peace and prosperity, which makes him totally unfit for war. Now, while I can't confirm this, I believe that Pervases might have been a regular Adeptus who admired the Yaksha and wished to train to become one, only he died before he was able to go past his junior rank. I don't think he had the aptitude to be a Yaksha, so I'm honestly not going to cover him any more than that. Now, the other Yaksha not named Xiao have a lot in common with each other, implying that they have some sort of shared roots. For example, each of their animal forms can be found in the Chinese zodiac: a snake, a dragon, a monkey, and a rat. Now, you might have noticed the complete absence of a crane or a Garuda. There's a rooster, but I don't really think a rooster works in place of a crane or a Garuda, even though they're both birds. Come on, it's a rooster. In addition to their shared beast symbolism, these 4 Yakshas also share a naming convention. They all have a primary name and then a military title that includes the name of their beast form. Now, while the Latin versions of their primary names are mostly nonsense, with the exception of Monogeus, which we will cover, I did notice that their Chinese names appear to reference the 4 noble truths of Buddhism. Now, I am going to grossly oversimplify this concept for the sake of clarity, but I will leave a link for further reading in the description if you're interested. Please note that these names are not definitively explicit references to these truths. They're just some interesting similarities that I thought were too coincidental to be accidental. These 4 Yaksha play a very important role in Xiao's overall character arc, which is mostly about learning how to release oneself from suffering. Thematically, the 4 noble truths ended up aligning really well with the 4 Yaksha of his past, which is why I'm even bringing it up, because the 4 noble truths are all about the process of releasing oneself from suffering. So you kind of see where I'm coming from, right? Now, my unenlightened non-Buddhist brain has translated this exceptionally complex teaching into the following. Truth 1. Acknowledging the symptoms of one's suffering. Truth 2. Diagnosing the cause of one's suffering. Truth 3. Prescribing and discovering a solution for one's suffering. And Truth 4 is ongoing treatment for one's suffering. And once again, the cool thing about this reference, providing it holds up and isn't just a coincidence, which would be wild, is that it kind of describes Xiao's overall character development arc, because each of his Yaksha friends would then represent a stage of his own enlightenment, or rather a lesson that Xiao can learn to ease his suffering in life, because he has so much. This will make more sense for later when we do a deep dive into Xiao's character development, but for now, we're going to take a look at each Yaksha individually, and I'll kind of explain my reasoning for each rule assignment to each Yaksha's name. Okay, this is the Electro Yaksha Bosacius, Martial Soaring Snake. In Chinese, he goes by Fu Shi and Martial Tingshu instead. Now, a Tingshu is a little bit more of a legless, armless, wingless dragon than a snake, so maybe flying serpent would be a better way to describe him. I make note of the dragon aspect though because his body is covered in these cloud tattoos, the same kind that are usually included in artwork for dragons. It's kind of ironic since his human form has 4 arms, that his beast form is typically without any arms at all, and it kind of feels like some overcompensation, you know? Now, Bosacius is the leader of the Yaksha, second in command to Morax. He also appears to be the eldest since all the others refer to him as Big Brother. Interestingly, if he's older than Xiao, and Xiao is anywhere between 2,500 and 3,000 years old, then Bosacius would have been alive prior to the start of the Archon War and may have even been part of the Guili Assembly. Unfortunately, there is no way to be sure of that at this time. I think Bosacius represents the first noble truth, the acknowledging one's symptoms of suffering, because this truth is all about accepting the state of the world as a whole as suffering. His Chinese name, Fu Shi, uses the same characters used to describe the illusory world of Buddhism, and it's the same phrase used during the Inazuma Archon quests in reference to A's whole meditation debacle. Acceptance is the first step towards releasing yourself from the bonds of suffering, and this concept seems to be reflected really well in Bosacius' personality through his pranks and easygoing nature, and his acknowledgement at the end of the Perilous Trail Quest that he is the one who is fated to make the greatest sacrifice. His end will be tragic and likely painful, but he has accepted it, and as a result, it became a great source of immense pride for him, and he is able to live every day free and without regret. Now this is the Hydroyaksha Bonennis, General Spiral Snail. In Chinese, she goes by Fanan and General Lo Qian. A spiral snail is less a snail and more like a conch, but her design didn't really scream snail or conch to me at all. So, while there are some very famous Chinese myths about a snail girl, I think Bonennis might actually be based on a creature known as a jiaotu. A jiaotu is a dragon-like water creature that lives inside a snail or conch shell, or it looks like a snail or a conch shell. No one's really sure. I can't find a very good source to clarify this for me. But given Bonennis's claw-like hands and horns, I think the draconic reference is a bit of a better fit than a, snail lady. Now, her Chinese name, Fanan, in my opinion, fits the third noble truth the best, as it's prescribing a solution for suffering. Her name means difficult to cut, and the nuance here is that finding solutions to problems is difficult, especially when things that tie us down are generally intangible. I'm reminded of the imagery of Xiao's karmic bonds. Cutting something out mentally is one of the most difficult things to do. Alright, so this is Indarius, the Pyro Yaksha, General Fire Rat. In Chinese, she goes by Yingda and General Hu Shou. Now, a Hu Shou is literally a rat that's on fire, or rather a rat whose coat is completely impervious to fire. That's legitimately all I could find on it. Now, her Chinese name, Yingda, appears to mean response reached, which seems to fit with the fourth noble truth I've dubbed ongoing treatment of suffering. Once one has identified problems and found a method to deal with them, one must actually put solutions into practice. There's not much else I have to say here, because that's all the information we have on Indarius. Yeah. I cannot say the same for Minogius, though, because we have a lot to talk about with him. This, like I said, is Minogius, also known as General Mind Monkey. In Chinese, he goes by Minu and General Xinyuan. So Minogius is kinda unique here in some less than obvious ways. First off, Mind Monkey is a direct reference to Sun Wukong, making him the only other Yaksha besides Xiao to reference a unique mythological figure rather than a generic race or type of beast. Now, Sun Wukong was born from a rock, which seems appropriate, and then obtained like 72 special powers through cultivation, and then he used those powers to rebel against Heaven. Heaven got pissed off and imprisoned him for like 500 years, and remember this, we'll come back to it. Now, the other thing that makes Menogias unique is that his Latinized name actually means something. And sure, Xiao's name, Alatus, means winged, which does suit a bird, which is what he is, but the other Latin names are just bunk. Menogias, on the other hand, appears to be a direct reference to the Greek Titan, Menetius, who is known as the Titan god of violent anger and rash action, which is ironic because Menogias looks like super chill. But this connection actually has some merit because his Chinese name is Minu, which just flat up means anger. Even better is the fact that the Asuras are often equated to Titans, and they live in a realm that is often called the realm of anger. And yes, I know he's a Yaksha, but remember what I said earlier, that Yaksha isn't like a super clearly defined race. It is often equated with other similar deities, and among those deities, the Asuras are included. So there's that. Now, I'm gonna don my tinfoil hat for a second here. If any of you have seen my last Harbinger video that I made right after the release of the Lazo teaser, you might remember my absolute crack theory about Capitano being the Geo Yaksha, because they have some visual similarities, and Capitano's armor looks like the armor that the Yaksha statues in Liyue, and I did emphasize that this was complete crack. It had like a 2% chance of being right, but now I think those odds kind of went up to 10%. There's still a 90% chance I'm wrong here, but anyway. See, the biggest reason I thought that this was impossible, even though it'd be cool, was that the timeline just didn't work out. Menogias would have died about 1,000 years ago, and while I don't think death can stop any historical character from being a Harbinger, all Harbingers so far share some kind of experience with the cataclysm of 500 years ago. Except for Child, but he doesn't count. He's an exception to everything. So, looking at that, we're about 500 years off the mark, right? Only that Menogias is a reference to Sun Wukong, who was imprisoned for 500 years, which means that if he died 1,000 years ago, he may have actually been imprisoned or restrained and then released 500 years later, putting him at the era of the cataclysm itself. I don't know how I feel about the fact that there's actually a way to make this timeline work now, because I am so bothered by this. Anyway, I am removing the tinfoil hat now. Also, I think Menogias is supposed to be the second noble truth, under diagnosis of suffering, since anger, and emotions in general, can definitely be a source of suffering. Also, if this is true, and I'm also right about him being Capitano, and I'm right about Capitano being ranked number 2 in the Harbingers, and he's the second noble truth, that's a lot of number 2 references, because he'd also be second in command probably to Bosacius, and you know what? I said the tinfoil hat was coming off, and it didn't actually come off. I am actually removing it now. Seriously though, if this is batshit, if it actually works, because there's a 90% chance I'm wrong, but I play gacha games, so that's a 10% odds, and that sounds kind of spicy. Sorry, let's move on to Xiao, shall we? Our little resident anomaly. Okay, this is the Yaksha most everyone is familiar with. This is Xiao. He is also one of the most misunderstood characters in the entire game. That's not really his fault, though. There's a lot that got lost in the localization. Now, the majority of the English community seems to at least see him as an edgy emo character or a tsundere stereotype. In reality, Xiao is an incredibly serious, detached, overprotective, and horrendously stubborn, independent character with no sense of self-worth. It's not quite the same thing. When Xiao was young, an evil god exploited his weakness, his true name, and enslaved him. He was then forced to commit atrocities against his will, including eating people's dreams, which I know doesn't seem all that horrible, but the nuance got lost, so we'll come back to this. It's because of this that Xiao carries an extreme amount of guilt to the point where he places next to no value on his own life. Meeting Morax was the turning point for him. Morax killed his former master and gave Xiao 3 gifts. He gave him a new name issued for his own protection, he gave him the freedom to choose his own actions, and he gave him a found family in the form of the other Yaksha. Xiao's fierce loyalty to Morax comes from this act specifically. And there's some really cool mythological basis for all of this loyalty too, but to understand that, we have to learn a little bit more about Xiao's inspiration. And all of that starts with a look at his names, because he has a few. Now, unlike the other Yaksha, Xiao has 3 names, not 2, and he does not use them the same way that the others do. The name Morax gave him, Xiao, means mountain demon, and it was chosen because it was the name of a person in another world who suffered greatly, which is fitting since the other Yaksha are named after ways of overcoming suffering. You see my thematic parallels here? Now the problem is, Xiao did not appear to use the name Xiao commonly until after the other Yaksha passed. The other Yaksha call him Alitus, or Jinpeng in Chinese, but that is not a name. That is just what his beast form is, a golden peng. It'd kind of be like if the other Yaksha called each other snake and rat, and, it's very impersonal. But Xiao likely did this, or asked them to do this, because he did not wish to use his true name since it had once been used to take advantage of him by his former master. If I had to guess about why he didn't just use the name Xiao instead, my guess is it's probably because he didn't feel worthy of this new name. Now, we don't actually know what Xiao's true name is, but during the A New Star Approaches Archon quest, Xiao says this.
My name means swiftness. Take my power and run as I do.
And then he promptly buffs your movement speed. The thing is, neither Xiao nor Alitus or Jinpeng have this meaning of swiftness. Like I said, Xiao is the name for a mountain demon, or something tiny. Alitus just means winged in Latin, and Jinpeng is just his beast form, which is a bird. This leads me to believe that Xiao's true name might be something more like Xinchuye or Qiaqigui. It means swiftness or swift ghost, respectively. Options here were presented courtesy of Teal Clover on Reddit. There's a link below. Also, please don't make fun of my Chinese. I'm really trying. It's very hard. Now, I've mentioned it a few times in passing, but Xiao's beast form, the Jinpeng, is very significant. Jinpeng literally means golden peng, peng being a type of bird, specifically a type of kite, falcon, or an eagle. On its own, this seems kinda inconsequential, but if you look at the Chinese name for Xiao's constellation, the reference becomes really obvious. Xiao's constellation in Chinese is Golden Wing Peng King, which is the English name for Dapeng Jinchi Mingwang, whose full name was Golden Winged Peng King of Illumination, and who is confirmed by Xiao's developer insights to be a primary source of inspiration for Xiao. Now, Dapeng Jinchi Mingwang is another name for Garuda, an important Buddhist and Hindu deity related to the races of Yaksha, Deva, and Ashura. In mythology, Garuda is related to Aruna, the deity who leads the chariot for the sun god, Surya. When Garuda's mother was enslaved, Garuda fought all the gods in heaven for her freedom, and won. It wasn't until he met Vishnu that he was taught how to be humble, and the two became an inseparable coupling of a king and his retainer, Garuda being the retainer. This parallels Xiao's story. Granted, it wasn't his mother that was enslaved, it was him, but he did fight countless gods as a terrifying bloodhound. Morax in this case would be Vishnu, the one who earned Garuda's loyalty. Vishnu was considered to be the epitome of everything a king should be, while Garuda represented the power of the king. You can kinda see this paralleled in how Zhongli and Xiao move. Zhongli never touches his spear, it's all telekinetic, and his movements are very smooth and precise. When using his shield, he also barely moves. This enforces his kingly position since kings are not that free to move about in any way that they like. A king has an image to maintain and needs to be visible and unruffled around his people. For this reason, a right-hand man, so to speak, is necessary. By contrast, Xiao's movements are wide, sweeping, and fast. He goes where he pleases and eliminates targets with reckless abandon. He moves so Morax doesn't have to. Likely all of the Yaksha would have been similar to Xiao in this way, though. But what's kind of neat about Xiao in particular is that his signature weapon, the primordial jade-winged spear, tells the story of the time Morax fought the sea dragon Bachao by fashioning a stone kite, the bird not the toy, to defeat it out at sea. Garuda is generally considered to be of the kite or falcon family, so this feels especially fitting. Now, I could, of course, talk about the nuances between Garuda and Xiao for ages, but there's one thing in particular I want to talk about which takes us into theory territory. Namely, that Xiao might not be from Liyue at all. He might actually be from Sumeru. In my opinion, Xiao is the only Yaksha with a direct tie to Sumeru. See, Garuda specifically is supposed to guard Mount Sumeru in Buddhist and Hindu mythology. It's true that there's no explicit evidence for Xiao having the same relation, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. See, Morax and co defeated a lot of gods all over Liyue during the Archon War. Xiao's former master was included in this. While the purpose of the war itself was to secure a seat in Celestia, most of the battles seem to have taken place as if they were territorial disputes. This is most explicitly seen in the case of Havria, who was weak and couldn't hold on to her land, and it just kept shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. Her story overall suggests that each god originally had more or less a set territory, which suggests to me that the exact borders of Liyue were not clearly defined until the end of the war. That means it's very possible that Xiao's former master had territory that bordered on both Liyue and Sumeru's modern border. I'm specifically placing the territory around this general area of Liyue-Sumeru borderland because we've learned recently that the Dendro Archon Kusanali, and possibly the Dendro element itself, is related to the concept of dreams. Now you'll remember that Xiao was forced to eat the dreams of his targets at the order of his master, so it's very possible that his master was either of the Dendro element or related to Sumeru in some way. Now, in Chinese, the types of dreams Xiao devoured are very specific. Xiao was only instructed to eat good dreams. This is likely referencing the mythical creatures in China known as Mo and in Japan as the Baku. Originally, the Mo devoured sickness in order to help people recover, but the Baku myth kinda changed things up. Instead of devouring sickness, you could call on them to eat the bad dreams so that you could sleep peacefully. So the idea here is that if eating bad dreams gives the person a good night's sleep, being forced to eat good dreams would cause people to have nightmares instead. He'd be inflicting trauma upon his victims by stealing away the dreams that brought them peace and happiness. Or potentially devouring their dreams as in their ambitions, as in the things that visions are supposed to be. Either way, this act of devouring dreams is very different from the adeptal art of dream trawler, wherein a user separates mind from body to achieve enlightenment, or Zhang Li's methods of sending the occasional message to people through their dreams. And as we've been getting more Sumeru teasers, I've been able to spot more suspicious hints that connect Xiao to Sumeru. Remember how Garuda guards Mount Sumeru? Well, Mount Sumeru is described as having the shape of an hourglass. And in one of the most recent Sumeru teasers, we got to see a giant double pyramid mountain in the shape of an hourglass out in the middle of the desert. The camera even starts off upside down and then rotates like an hourglass would. Heck, its location in the desert might even be a whole Sands of Time reference, which would be kind of wild when you think about it. And the desert tombs that we saw in the same teaser have some statues that look like birdmen. Now granted, these statues look more Egyptian than anything else and are probably depictions of Horus and Anubis, but if I may don my tinfoil hat again for a minute, Horus was usually depicted as a falcon, and a falcon is a type of kite, just like Garuda. He's also a symbol of kingship, just like Garuda through his relationship with Vishnu. He's also a sun deity, and Garuda's brother was the charioteer of the sun god. Horus also had an antagonistic relationship with the god Set, who assumes the form of an animal that looks quite a bit like a Baku or a Mo with that weirdly long curved nose. Now, I'm not saying they're related, I'm just saying they're sus. For all I know, these statues could just be of Khonsu instead. That idea also has some merit, but it's a completely separate discussion and has nothing to do with the Adepti. And yeah, okay, I know that Xiao is an Adeptus, and I know that Adepti are supposed to be unique to Liyue, and therefore it's impossible for Xiao to even be partially from Sumeru. but consider the possibility that illuminated beasts are going to be found everywhere in Teyvat. They may not even use the label of Adepti, but they'll still have all the same attributes. Yae Miko is a perfect example of this phenomena, and her existence, as well as the existence of the half-animal characters like Goro and Sucrose, lead me to believe that the illuminated beasts are kind of like demigods, while half-animals like Diona are the product of humans and demigods intermingling over time, which therefore means that these demigods can exist in all nations as different types of beasts. But I feel like I could make a whole video on this topic, so I'm just going to leave that there for right now. Now we still have one loose end to tie up, so let's talk fate by looking at Xiao's constellations. I mentioned before that each of the other 4 Yaksha had a sort of life lesson that they represented for Xiao, and I think this is mirrored throughout his constellations as those outline his character arc. Now, several of Xiao's constellations are referred to as eons, or in Chinese as kalpas. It's exactly what it sounds like, a period of time, generally a part or a whole cycle of death and rebirth. In Buddhism, there are specific types of kalpas that relate directly to Xiao's constellations. Xiao's constellations begin with dissolution, referencing his enslavement to his former master and the kalpas of destruction. This is followed by his second constellation, annihilation, which is a little bit less obvious. The Annihilation Kalpas is about liberation, which suits the part of Xiao's life where he was freed by Morax. The third constellation then, Conqueror of Evil, is simply one of his titles, likely one obtained during the war. Then there's Constellation 4, Transcension, the Extinction of Suffering. You could take this a couple of different ways, but I've come to think of this as Xiao reconciling the death of his Yaksha comrades, since I think their Chinese names are referencing the ways to end suffering. This is Xiao learning their lessons. That makes his 5th constellation, Evolution, Origin of Ignorance, Xiao's journey to seek out the truth, which allows him to become his true self, the Guardian Yaksha, at his final Constellation 6. Story-wise, Xiao appears to be around Constellation 5 as of the Perilous Trail Archon quest. I mean, the whole quest was just about Xiao seeking out the truth of what happened to Bosacius, and ironically, it's Morax that stands in the way of Xiao and his pursuit of the truth because poor Morax thinks it's too dangerous and he doesn't want to lose any more of his companions, and quite frankly, I can't really blame him. Now, my favorite part of the entire quest here starts at this moment where we get to see Xiao confronting Morax about this very topic. On the surface, it looks like Xiao is requesting permission to go on a solo mission, but that's not actually what's happening here. This is actually the continuation of an argument that these two have had at least twice. Xiao is stubborn by nature and thinks it's his responsibility to seek out the fates of his comrades, so he has been slowly wearing down Morax's opposition over periods of time. This is the moment that his king finally relents to his knight and allows him to do as he likes with his reluctant blessing. And not to backpedal on my own statements here, but the real reason why Morax didn't want to give Xiao permission in the first place wasn't because the journey was gonna be too dangerous. It was because Morax knew exactly how much Xiao does not value his own life. If given the chance, he can and will sacrifice himself without considering any other options. I personally think Morax regrets what happened with the other Yaksha, and that he wasn't able to help them, and now that Xiao is the only one left, he feels like a greater sense of responsibility towards him. Especially since Xiao isn't very keen on keeping himself alive. Poor old man has lost way too many friends over the years. Can't blame him for this. So Morax's permission came with some fine print. Specifically that he would be watching over Xiao from a distance and would interfere if he deemed it necessary. You'll notice that he did not ask permission to save Xiao, nor did he tell him to be careful, and he probably didn't even tell him that he'd be nearby in case something went wrong. If he had done any of those things, Xiao wouldn't have looked so shocked during this absolute banger moment. I mean, put yourself in Xiao's shoes for a moment and imagine that the person whose opinion and judgment you value even above your own, just saving your life without a single word of warning, reprimand, or condition. They decided that your life was worth saving, so maybe, just maybe your life might have some real value after all. That's the lesson that Xiao has to learn, and is learning in his Constellation 5 in order to obtain his Constellation 6. Morax wants Xiao to fight for his right to live. He is not a weapon that can simply be discarded. That is completely at odds with how Xiao views himself. And not only is there this whole silent conversation happening between Zhongli and Xiao, but there's this really subtle subplot happening throughout the entire quest at the same time. Remember that Yanfei was brought to the chasm due to a will, like a last will and testament, and throughout the entire quest, there's this kinda ongoing discussion about meaningful deaths, fulfilling the wishes of the deceased, and what it means to be a survivor, and honestly, what it means to have survivor's guilt. This applies to Yelan and Xiao in particular, although Yelan is in a slightly better, healthier headspace than Xiao is. Now here's the thing. In the book Heart's Desire, and in Xiao's developer interviews, it's stated that if an illuminated beast dies with its wishes unfulfilled, they leave behind a crystal heart. And in the official artwork for the quest and the menu screen for the associated event, Xiao is seen holding a small item that looks a bit like a rock inside of a pale flame. Behind him is the silhouette of Bosacius. Now, for all the emphasis placed on this item in these massive artworks, we never see it during the entire quest. But at the end of the quest, Xiao talks to the traveler about his attempt to bring back a stone that he found within the chasm and that he intended to leave in Pervasi's temple as a monument to Bosacius. There is reason to believe that that stone was not a normal stone. It was a crystal heart left behind by an unfulfilled Bosacius. Now, in Zhongli's second story quest, we learn that stones can hold memories. The more pure the stone, the more memories they can hold, and the clearer those memories become. By that logic, a crystal or stone heart left behind by an illuminated beast or Yaksha is basically just like a last will and testament. So that means that when Bosacius told Xiao that it's the responsibility for the surviving Yaksha to pursue the fates of the ones that have fallen, he was really telling Xiao to collect and maybe inherit the last wills of his companions. And by forcibly preventing Xiao's self-sacrifice, Morax really emphasized that in order to carry out those last wills and to understand what it means to be the one to have them, Xiao needed the will to live. And that is the only way he can become the true guardian Yaksha. You can't protect anyone if you're dead. You know, I could honestly talk about the Yaksha and the Adepti for hours, but I think this is enough for right now. Xiao is the character that convinced me to play Genshin in the first place, so the Yaksha will always hold a very special place in my heart, and I loved the Perilous Trail arc on Quest so much. It makes me so excited for future story beats, and I cannot wait to share those moments with all of you. Thanks so much for watching this video, guys. I know it was a long one, but I hope it gave you the same appreciation for Xiao and the Yakshas that I have. Whether it did or not, let me know down below. I want to give a special thanks to Zen, Zara, and Xuan, who all helped me work on this theory, and thanks to all of you for watching again, especially all new channel members. You guys are amazing, and I wouldn't be here without you, so you know what? Take care. I'll see you guys in the next video.